Just want to make sure we're on time here. So, hello everybody, and welcome to today's meeting of the Senate Climate Change Task Force. I want to thank the Amalgamated Bank, Ceres, Americans for Financial Reform, and the Ocean Conservancy for coming to share their knowledge with us. And I want to thank my colleagues for taking the time out of their schedules to discuss this important issue. What was once considered extreme weather is unfortunately now the new normal. Throughout this summer, the United States has experienced devastating heat waves, putting 100 million Americans under heat warnings across the country. People are dying in Kentucky as a result of extreme rain and floods, rain that still has not stopped. Communities throughout the United States are facing deadly wildfires, floods, and droughts, all of which have become more frequent with the onset of climate change. But it's not just communities that face risks from climate catastrophes. Our economy and our financial system itself are massively exposed to threats and shocks from climate change, putting livelihoods on the line along with the lives of people who are put at risk. Climate change will potentially expose publicly traded corporations to billions in climate damages and liabilities, meaning those losses get passed on to their investors. For example, when Hurricane Laura hit a chlorine factory in Louisiana in August of 2020, KIK Consumer Products, the company that owns the plant, had to spend $170 million to rebuild it. This $170 million price tag did not include the public health and environmental costs faced by the predominantly black community of Lake Charles, near which this chlorine factory was located. Public investors have a right to know about the potential impacts that a company's operations might have on their pocketbooks. Other countries are already taking action to make sure companies can't hide the risks that climate change poses to their financial health from their stakeholders. The United States can't be left behind if we want a functional financial system. And that's why I applaud the Securities and Exchange Commission for issuing the proposed rule on the enhancement and standardization of climate-related disclosures for investors. I believe this rule will be helpful to investors big and small, to pensioners, retirees, to hedge fund managers, to make sound financial decisions in a rapidly changing world. Of course, there are ways the rule could be even stronger, and I'm excited to hear about them from our witnesses today. With that, I would like to introduce our witnesses. Steve Rothstein from my home state of Massachusetts is the founder and managing director of the Ceres Accelerator for Sustainable Capital Markets. Steve will share with us today how the proposed rule is within the SEC's authority and is within their mandate and is comparable to climate-related financial regulations worldwide. Next, we have Ivan Frishberg, the Senior Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer of Amalgamated Bank. I'm here today to discuss how public markets have already been responding to financial risk posed by climate change and how the proposed rule would help to standardize and synchronize these responses. We are also lucky to have Moon Young Ko, the Climate Finance Campaign Manager at Americans for Financial Reform. Moon Young is joining us virtually and will share with us how investors need mandatory reporting for greenhouse gas and Scope 3 emissions. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce Anath, who serves as the Director of Climate and Plastics for the Ocean Conservancy. Arthi will share with us why the SEC must understand risks to communities most impacted by climate change and legacy pollution, and what the consequences are for investors who don't have that information. So I want to thank all of you for your participation today. We're expecting intermittently senators to come and to join us, in the course of the Q&A, we'll have a chance actually to go back and reprise the highlights of your testimony here today. So we'll begin the testimony with you, Mr. Rothstein.
Thank you, Senator, for your leadership. I also want to just recognize your staff that's done an enormous job and really appreciate all the work that they've done. Again, Stephen Rothstein, I'm the Managing Director of the Ceres Accelerator for Sustainable Capital Markets. Ceres is a nonprofit based in Boston, been around for over 30 years. We do a variety of things, but we represent investors. Our investor network is 220 investors that represent $60 trillion of assets under management. And they come to Ceres because they're concerned about the long-term sustainability and trying to get that information. And I want to try to address three questions very, very briefly. Is this something that the investors care about? Does the SEC have authority to address these? And how do these fit into the international standards? First, is it something the investors care about? Investors have been overwhelmingly calling for this. In fact, in 2003, Ceres and investors had our first meeting with the SEC asking for climate disclosure. Then in 2010, the SEC adopted climate disclosure guidelines. So for 12 years, there have been climate disclosure guidelines in place. Investors need comparable, useful information so they can make decisions on behalf of the people who invest with them and their pension holders. Nearly 800 companies and 733 investors representing $52 trillion have called on the G20 countries for mandatory disclosure. Today, investors are not receiving, as you said, Senator, accurate information. So it's leading to greenwashing and challenges in the marketplace. Investors are not just asking governments to do it, they're doing it with their own portfolios through groups like the Net Zero Asset Managers. They have committed over $61 trillion of assets have committed to being net zero in the coming years as part of that. And it's not just investors. The poll was conducted earlier this year where 87% of people supported climate disclosure with the government, including 74% of Republicans. So this is a broad-based support on this area. Second question, very briefly, is does the SEC have authority to do this? The answer is absolutely yes. Their mission is to, quote, protect investors, maintain a fair and orderly, efficient market, and facilitate capital formation. Due to the growing climate risks that you and obviously Senator Whitehouse knows so well and talked about them so many times, it's only possible through mandatory disclosure. I'll just give you two quick examples. There was a group of SEC scholars, 15 former officials, 4 former chairs, including bipartisan members of the SEC, that they wrote in a letter recently to the SEC, quote, we write to express a unanimous view that the SEC has clear statutory authority to mandate additional climate-related disclosures. In fact, they said that the SEC has been addressing climate issues since the Nixon administration on a bipartisan basis. Another group of securities lawyers wrote that, in fact, this is very much in line with the work the SEC has done on issues from Y2K to cybersecurity to asbestos and many, many other things. Third quick question is how does this fit into the international context? We appreciate the leadership of the SEC, but even if everything they propose was adopted today, the U.S. would still be behind. There are 8 countries that have mandatory disclosure today that are further ahead, and some go even further than what the SEC is proposing. And there are an international group, IFRS, is working on this for 140 countries. So in short, if the SEC doesn't act boldly and quickly, that our country is going to be behind, and our companies are going to be behind in terms of following international rules. So companies and investors can only manage what they can measure. They can't do that today. This is a critical step for job creation, for information, for investor security. So we appreciate the leadership of this task force, and thank you very much for the invitation.
And thank you, Mr. Rothstein, for your leadership. Next, we have Ivan Frishberg, the Senior Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer of Amalgamated Bank. Ivan is here today to discuss how public markets have already been responsible to risks posed by climate and how the proposal would help to standardize and synchronize these responses across the market. Welcome, Mr. Frishberg.
Thank you, Chairman Markey, Senator Whitehouse, members of the task force. Thank you for your leadership and the opportunity to testify today. I'm also proud to offer Amalgamated Bank support for the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 and another that's being taken on the climate crisis. Amalgamated Bank views the unfolding climate crisis as a defining issue of how we navigate our future. Recent years have shown investors and the financial community the compounding and provided a clear example of how our economy and our world are becoming more turbulent and more volatile. Arming investors with the information that they need to navigate this future is the job of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Amalgamated Bank is a founding member of the United Convened Net Zero Banking Alliance, the UN Principles for Responsible Banking, and the Partnership for Carbon Accounting, that is the global standard for measuring financed emissions, or Scope 3, within the finance sector. In 2021, we set climate targets as a company and have been approved by the Science Based Targets Initiative. And in the last 5 years, we have grown our financing of climate solutions to 32% of our loan and investment portfolio on balance sheet. Climate change is an unparalleled driver of volatility and extremes, as you have mentioned. The rapidly growing layer of heat-trapping gases is condensing changes that once happened over millennia into mere decades, providing economies, markets, cultures, nature, inadequate time to adapt. And while the Securities and Exchange Commission does not have a role in regulating environmental matters or protecting the world from the catastrophic consequences of disruptive atmospheric systems, the SEC does have a mandate to ensure that investors are protected, that markets are fair, orderly, and efficient, and to facilitate capital formation. For this reason, we strongly support the SEC's proposal on climate-related disclosures and acknowledge the Commission's unique authority to address the issue of climate-related financial risk and its implications for investor protection and market efficiency. Chairman Gensler is delivering exactly what the SEC mandate calls for, no more and no less. The Financial Stability Oversight Council has identified climate change as an emerging and increasing threat to U.S. financial stability. The CFTC was also clear in finding that climate change possesses a major risk to the stability of the U.S. financial system and its ability to sustain the American economy. It specifically calls for U.S. financial regulators to move urgently and decisively to measure, understand, and address these risks. That prescription to measure, understand, and address these risks is exactly what financial institutions have been doing for many years. TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, is supported by more than 3,000 companies with a market capitalization of $27 trillion. CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project, now receives climate disclosures from 13,000 companies globally with 64% of global market capitalization. And in this information, it is requested and used by 680 financial institutions with $130 trillion in assets. The Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials is now adopted as the fundamental accounting system to measure financed or Scope 3 emissions, and it has been adopted by more than 300 financial firms with $80 trillion in assets. I think between this interest and the interest that Stephen articulated earlier, we clearly see that there is a desire and a need to answer climate risk within the financial system. But currently, climate risk disclosures in the U.S. have relied on these voluntary frameworks. And while they are widely adopted, these disclosures are often grossly inconsistent, even within like sectors. This presents significant limitations on and undermines the investor ability to adequately address risk and respond accordingly. Consistent, comparable, and reliable disclosures on the material climate-related risk public companies face would serve both investors and capital markets. And I'm missing my last page. Apologies. The proposed rule has sparked significant conversation about the breadth of disclosures required, specifically on the topic of Scope 3 emissions reporting. Climate risks are principally systemic and flow up and down the value chain. It's important that for these disclosures, these risks be comparable and consistent in terms that can be understood outside the fence line on a single company, but also consider its connection to the value chain. A manufacturing and engineering company that does not count emissions from its product, but only its manufacturing process, is not presenting the full picture of its exposure and the market risk that comes with it. We greatly appreciate the diligent and comprehensive work done by the Commission in presenting these disclosure rules. We strongly believe that the full scope emissions is an essential ingredient in disclosures that serve investors. Our economy is already facing a series of cascading shocks connected to our disrupted climate. The pace of U.S. and global real economy policy is not currently adequate to avoid dangerous levels of warming, and making the work of the SEC even more important for investors. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this afternoon, and happy to answer any questions you might have.
And again, thank you, Mr. Frishberg, so much. We're also lucky to have Moon Young Ko, the Climate Finance Campaign Manager at Americans for Financial Reform. Moon Young is joining us virtually and will share with us how investors need mandatory reporting for greenhouse gas and Scope 3 emissions. So welcome, Moon Young.
Good afternoon. My name is Moon Young Ko, and I'm the Climate Finance Campaign Manager at Americans for Financial Reform. Americans for Financial Reform, also known as AFR, is a nonprofit that was founded in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Our mission is to protect the public from financial harms caused by banks and other financial institutions and promote financial regulations that can help build a more fair, equitable, racially just, and sustainable economy. I'm honored to be here today and thank Senator Markey, his staff, and the Senate Climate Change Task Force for inviting me to speak about the Securities and Exchange Commission's recent proposed rule on climate-related disclosures for investors. Before I dive into more detail, I would like to reiterate what the previous witnesses have stated. The SEC's proposed rule on climate disclosure falls squarely within the SEC's mandate, and it's being promulgated in response to a clear market failure that investors have identified, both institutional and retail investors alike. In response to this type of failure, the SEC has not just the authority, but a responsibility to act to preserve fairness and transparency in the capital markets, and they have used that authority time and time again as new issues have arisen. Given the growing economic risks caused by the climate crisis and the shift towards a clean energy transition, investors increasingly want and need more standardized information about companies' climate-related financial risks, their contributions to climate change, and their plans for remaining solvent in a low-carbon economy. The SEC's proposed climate disclosure rule is a step in the right direction, but to fully protect investors and address the market failure, Scope 3, or the disclosure of emissions within a company's value chain, must be strengthened in the final rule. Here are our 3 proposals to strengthen emissions reporting, particularly Scope 3. 1. The proposed rule states that Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions disclosures are only required if the issuer determines they are material or has a set public Scope 3 emissions target. The majority of most companies' greenhouse gas emissions are Scope 3, making the scope a major source of transition risk. For example, a recent study from Climate Advisors found that 83% of food sector emissions fall under Scope 3. Allowing companies to self-determine whether Scope 3 emissions are material will lead to underreporting of those emissions and their associated risk. We saw this result before when the SEC used this approach in its 2010 climate risk guidance, and that led to significant underreporting. Instead, we encourage the SEC to require disclosure of all Scope 3 emissions by all registrants. In addition, we recommend that the final rule require companies to provide location data, U.S. zip code or country for the location of a fixed point source, or large disclosed sources of Scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions, wherever it is feasible, which will help investors assess variable physical and transition risks specific to a location or jurisdiction. 2. The proposal as written allows Scope 3 emissions to be disclosed without reasonable assurance provided by an independent third party. Reasonable assurance means that an independent third-party accountant will audit the data just as they do the financial statements, allowing them to ask staff follow-up questions around the methodology and ensure the reliability of the numbers that are being reported. Not requiring reasonable assurance by an independent third-party accountant greatly reduces the reliability and trustworthiness of the information provided to investors. We recommend that the SEC require this independent verification for Scopes 1, 2, and 3 disclosures on the same timeline based on the size of the filer. 3. When publicly traded private equity firms exert financial or operational control over a portfolio company, those operational emissions should qualify not as Scope 3 investment emissions, as a proposal would allow, but rather Scope 1 and 2 operational emissions. Private equity firms often invest in and control some of the largest, dirtiest fossil fuel operations in the world and generate massive amounts of carbon emissions, generating significant risk. In addition to requiring Scopes 1, 2, and 3, regardless of materiality, the SEC should also require Scope 1 and 2 emissions disclosure for portfolio companies, in line with the draft disclosure platform from the International Sustainability Standards Board. Without a mandatory standardized process for public companies to disclose their climate-related financial risks, investors will remain in the dark and not have the information they need to assess risk to their investments, including those derived from impacts that their investments have on climate change or on impacted communities and countries. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Moon Young. And our final witness, again, Arthi is here with us. We thank you so much for your willingness to participate, and please begin whenever you feel comfortable.
Thank you, Senator Markey, and members of the Climate Change Task Force for having me today. My name is Arthi Ananthanarayanan, and I'm a director of the Climate and Plastics Initiative at Ocean Conservancy. Ocean Conservancy works to ensure a healthy ocean supported by a more just world. Along our coasts, climate risk is already real for far too many Americans and businesses coping with severe storms, rising seas, and changing ecosystems. We support improved disclosure because it equips investors to make informed decisions that benefit coastal economies, communities, and the ocean. The SEC's proposal responds to investor demand for more transparency and clear guidelines about climate risk, and it creates a level playing field for companies. I want to highlight an aspect of climate-related financial risk that isn't covered in the proposed rule: the impact of corporate activities on people and communities, particularly disadvantaged communities that are disproportionately likely to be impacted by climate change. Companies face fierce community resistance and jeopardize their businesses when they don't sufficiently consider the effects of their activities on the health, safety, and livelihoods of communities, particularly where this intersects with climate risk. We've developed several case studies of companies facing the fallout: earnings shortfalls, debt rating downgrades, declines in share price, and destruction of shareholder value. And investors need to understand this component of risk as well. For example, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe challenged Energy Transfer LP over the Dakota Access Pipeline for the pipeline's potential to endanger drinking water and cultural resources, protests that fueled public outcry over the climate impacts of the project. And as a result, project costs tripled, and Energy Transfer suffered a long-term decline in value. Over the last decade, Indigenous-led resistance has stopped or delayed at least 14 fossil fuel projects in the US and Canada. Another example is the impact of increased flooding on toxic waste sites. In North Carolina, Duke Energy Corporation faces upwards of $10 billion in settlement and cleanup costs after community groups sued the company over claims of leaking toxic pollution from coal ash ponds at risk from flooding. And we know this information is important to investors. The Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which, as Ivan highlighted, is supported by over 3,000 companies, highlights negative community perception as a component of climate-related financial risk. And a recent survey of retail investors found that almost half would consider in their investment decisions a company's record on environmental justice, indigenous rights, and impacts on communities if that information were standardized, free, and easy to find. And this is the aim of the SEC's proposal. It ensures that investors get the comparable, consistent, and reliable data they need. I'll close with a case of particular relevance to the ocean and coastal communities. The plastic production industry along the U.S. Gulf Coast is highly exposed to extreme weather as well as volatile oil and gas markets. The industry produces significant greenhouse gas emissions all along the value chain, not to mention growing attention on virgin plastic pollution as a source of demand for fossil fuels. In Louisiana, Formosa Petrochemical Corporation is facing significant opposition to a new plastics complex, projected to be the largest new source of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S., and it would double toxic air pollution in St. James Parish, a predominantly Black community on the front lines of climate change. Rise St. James has led opposition to the project, drawing widespread public attention and global media attention, and the company now faces higher costs, greater regulatory scrutiny, and damage to its reputation. Climate risk is a financial reality, and community impacts are a critical aspect of that climate-related financial risk, with serious consequences for a company's performance. By requiring transparency about how public companies make decisions that affect the future of their businesses, the SEC is fulfilling its mission to protect investors. Only then can investors make informed decisions and work together with companies as we move through a climate transition that sustains American jobs, our communities, and our economy. Thank you.
So thank you so much, and thanks to each and every one of our witnesses. We're joined by Senator Whitehouse, and we will be joined by other senators. Again, it's a traffic jam at this moment every Tuesday. So I think in order to get the conflict that exists right now, I think we have to go to which companies are fighting this, and why they're fighting it, and what the legitimacy of their argument is to resist these changes. And by the way, this all goes back to 2009 and 2010. This goes back to, three things we were doing. One was the Waxman-Markey bill, but second, we inserted this into the Dodd-Frank bill for disclosure. And then thirdly, we had $90 billion for clean energy subsidies. So the SEC and the $90 billion for clean energy technologies, they survived, but many things come to the Senate, never to be heard from again. So although we're seeing a revival right now in a different form, and hopefully we can get it passed this week. So let's talk about those companies and the legitimacy of their opposition, if anyone would like to take it on.
I'll kick it off, Senator. First, on the flip side, let me tell you three companies that support this broadly. Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Citi. Now, they don't support every provision, but they submitted written public testimony and saying they support what the SEC is doing. It's very important. They do have a number of specific changes. We don't agree with all those, but in terms of the opposition, if you think about the American Petroleum Institute, think about the Chamber of Commerce, those are leading the opposition on that, and clearly they don't understand that climate is a risk, and that investors have been saying it for decades, as I said earlier before, Senator.
Okay. Anybody else in that opposition group?
I'll speak to one of the dynamics within the corporate sector that's opposing the Scope 3 emissions disclosures. And as Moon-Young referenced, there's a trigger in the proposed rule which we think should be strengthened. It says that if you find it material to your company, then you disclose. That, when we've engaged with companies as an asset manager on this question of emissions and alignment with the low carbon economy, not one of those companies says, oh, thank you for reaching out. You're right, this is material and we're just figuring out what to do. They all start from the premise of saying, this is not material. Emissions in Scope 3 is not material to us. And then the more time we spend with them, the more they start to understand, and ultimately most of them will agree before going to a shareholder vote, that in fact this is something that is within their control, it's something that can actually provide opportunities, and they turn around. But that fear over being accountable for Scope 3 emissions is part of what has organized, I think, primarily the fossil fuel sector and their business associations to organize against this and to sort of play on that fear.
Well, what are the revisions that they're looking for? What are they asking for in the rulemaking?
Well, I think they would like to start over and get rid of the whole thing.
So you're saying this is like complete, absolute opposition to anything happening? Not modification, not adjustment, but just,
There are some who are clearly in that position.
Yeah.
Saying should all be
and
voluntary.
that's the American Petroleum Institute and the Chamber of Commerce. Is that what you're
They
saying?
want it to be voluntary, and, there are others that say they want it spread out over a much longer period. They want to get rid of Scope 3, but so there's a wide range. But some absolutely don't want anything mandatory.
Okay, anybody else want to add in? Great, thank you. Let me recognize, I'm sorry.
I'd like to just add that many of the opposition, as the other witnesses have stated, are coming from the oil and gas industry. And that's mainly due to the fact that many of their product emissions or Scope 3 emissions from that sector are typically 10%. The oil and gas has been leading investors through their marketing practices, and in greenwashing, their statements to investors is a really important step for ensuring that this type of disclosure is readily available to investors, whether they're large institutional investors or retail investors.
Okay, beautiful, thank you. Let me turn and recognize Senator Whitehouse.
Senator Markey, I was just going to flag somebody who's watched the behavior and misbehavior of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for some time now, that about 3 years ago, they started to get heat from their members about their anti-climate position. They were top climate obstructors under the influence map analysis that was done, along with the National Association of Manufacturers. That did not go well with some of their members. So what they have done is they've taken those members and they've put them in a little corral where they have a climate conversation with them, a climate conversation from which no action ever emerges. And what's interesting to see is anything good that the chamber is asked to do on climate goes into that climate conversation where it comes to a halt and dies. But attacking this rule, that didn't go into that climate conversation. That went straight into chamber operations. And I think it's high time that the big companies that have been either fooled or willfully blind about where they've been stuck in this little chamber climate conversation started to revive their energy about what the chamber is really up to. Anything good on climate the chamber is asked to do goes and dies in the climate conversation. Anything evil the chamber is asked to do on climate change goes straight into operations without even a bounce in the climate conversation. And the fact that there are two tracks, depending on whether it's anti-climate or pro-climate, and the pro-climate is a box canyon dead end, and the anti-climate uses all the power and all the might of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is by a factor of 3 the biggest lobbying organization in the country, tells a lot about the sincerity of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on climate stuff. So to that end, one of the things that we have pushed is that as part of disclosures, companies should not only disclose their carbon footprint, but they should disclose their carbon political footprint. And it shouldn't be too hard to audit that. If the company discloses to the auditors what they're doing, you can readily determine the climate positions of members of Congress they support. You can readily determine the climate positions of trade associations and lobby groups they support. And if they were being candid, they would disclose their dark money contributions, and you could readily determine where the dark money went with respect to climate policy. And I think what you would find from that, and I think the reason that we can't find it out, is that for CEOs, they would have to report to their shareholders that what they had told them and what they told the public was very different from what they were letting their trade associations and lobby groups tell us here in Congress. And Senator Markey and I see this day in and day out. So in addition to the problem of the chamber having 2 roads, corporate America as a general proposition has 2 roads. And We unfortunately in Congress listen to the big trade associations and the big lobby groups because they're the ones who come here through thick, through thin, participate in campaigns, lobby consistently. A CEO can make a statement in Manhattan and it will have about the effect of a raindrop. But when that CEO's industry trade association comes here to put their footprint on Congress, it has a much more powerful effect. And the discrepancy between what CEOs are saying and what their trade associations and lobby groups are doing, I think, is a reputational risk exposure for those companies. So it's not just a question of trying to get them to do the right thing. It's a question of shareholders need to know if their company management is playing this game. That's a long way of getting to the question of, is it a reputational risk for companies if their company management is playing the game of telling shareholders and consumers one thing about their climate position and deploying trade association artillery in Congress that takes the exact opposite position?
Absolutely, Senator, and welcome, Senator Brown. And as Senator Whitehouse knows, I mean, Ceres works with companies all over that come to Capitol Hill on this issue, and it is. We actually produced a report called Responsible Policy Engagement that looked at the top 100 companies and found that 80 of them say they have a climate plan, 20 of them are lobbying against it, 40 of them don't take any position in Congress.
Except through their trade associations.
Except for the trade association.
Yeah.
So you're exactly right. It's an enormous issue, Senator.
Great. I'll leave it to that. Senator Brown is here. He's the
Okay.
chairman of the
Yeah,
banking
well,
committee. I don't
Arthur,
want
do
to,
you have
anybody else
anything
wants
you
to
wanna
answer
say?
quickly, of course, but
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Going to add from the business perspective, if you were to abdicate your responsibility for part of your business and tell your board or your shareholders, we let somebody else control that, you'd be out of a job very quickly.
Right.
But but that is exactly what they're doing to their political voice. And it is not naively done. And it is done with very significant consequences. And as you point out, Senator Whitehouse, very significant risks.
Yeah,
to the company and to the shareholders.
Exactly.
yeah, and I'm going to recognize Senator Brown, but I want you to be thinking about what's the simplest way you can explain Scope 3? Put it into English, why it's so important. Now, I'll come back later, but just have that, cogitate on that so that we can translate it into, the escape hatch, which many of these huge corporations are going to try to find. So let me recognize. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Okay, so let me recognize the great chairman of the Senate Banking Committee.
Thank you, and I
Senator
appreciate
Brown.
it. I appreciate hearing. I always appreciate hearing Senator Whitehouse, my classmate of many years ago, came to the Senate together on that. And thank you, and Mr. Frishberg, thanks for the work that your bank does for workers and so many things that you sort of stand apart. And I know Senator Whitehouse's comments were a little bit the minister preaching to the few people in the congregation about why the others aren't here today. So, but thank you for that. I just want to just flesh out for a second. I just really have one question about what the SEC is doing, and we work in my committee on a number of things with Chairman Gensler on cryptocurrency, on disclosure of all kinds of issues. What if any one of you answered the question, what will their disclosure rules mean to our efforts to combat climate change? I mean, talk to me about how it will change the behavior, in light, partly what Sheldon said, how it will change the behavior of your bank or Ceres or the work you do at the Conservancy.
I mean, I would start by saying, just because a risk isn't disclosed doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So, these disclosure rules are all about equipping investors to identify and reward those companies that are innovating to meet the needs of our society, of our communities, that are managing their risks, and that are rewarding their investors. And so, unless we have that adequate transparency, we won't be able to identify those climate-related opportunities and build in the resilience that companies need, that communities need to weather this climate transition.
Thanks. Mr. Frishberg.
I mean, we see this. So Amalgamated Bank we've set science-based targets. We've now disclosed 3 years of Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions. We are managing those emissions to targets. And so that provides us data internally at the firm to be able to say, okay, we understand where the emissions are, we understand where the growth and the business opportunity is. We can use that data as part of everything else that we do in the bank to manage that. And so I feel like this, even setting aside the investor concern here, the ability internally to manage to this data is really critical. And so we see it in practice throughout our business. But the investor piece is essential. Like that, this is where, you know, when we act as an advisor and as a manager, we're going to these companies and saying, you have a risk here. And they say, really? And when you start to get into it, they kind of understand it and they start to absorb that, in fact, this is something they need to pay attention to, and they end up going down the road almost every single time as saying, yes, we're going to start to figure and measure our risks here and put data behind it so that we can start to manage it.
So can you, Mr. Frishberg and Mr. Rothstein, can you say, or are you suggesting that this disclosure will actually make you not just a more socially responsible bank, but actually perhaps make you a more profitable bank, make you a better institution?
Yes. I mean, this is, I think, what we're doing here is, do you want more data? Do investors want more data? Will companies have more data? Will the data quality be better? That's really what this rule is doing. And anybody that thinks they're going to be in business and not like benefit from that data, I think maybe they should pick a different career.
But would you say but would most banks understand that, what you just said? Would they agree with that?
Yes, and this is why, you know, we talk about the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, so that, you know, the methodology for measuring scope 3 in the finance sector, that's now we have close to $80 trillion of assets lined up behind that. They include many of the banks that Stephen mentioned were supporting the SEC rule broadly, and they are, on a voluntary basis, starting to implement and do that work. And this is globally. But I think the opposition is really coming from the high emission sectors that don't want this to be built into the system, that they don't want investors or the public or the financial sector to have access to this information.
Mr. Rothstein?
And so we're a nonprofit representing investors, collectively $60 trillion of assets, some of the largest investors to small ones. Investors want this because to reduce their risk. There isn't any investor that says, if I have more information, my risk will go down, and they want to have a consistency. They've been calling this for 20 years. We had our first meeting, Senator, with the SEC with investors in 2003. Last year, over 50 investors representing $52 trillion. Half of the managed assets went to the G20, including the U.S., and saying we want mandatory disclosure. So it would reduce the risk and therefore give more climate perspective. We all see the floods, the fires, or tornadoes. And it's not just the company, but their supply chain that is at risk. As we've seen through this heartbreaking element of the last 3 years from the pandemic and the supply chain elements there, the same thing Senator asked about scope 3, it's really looking at the supply chain and understanding those risks, Senator.
Thank you. Senator Walker.
I'd also like to add that this is, in addition to the larger institutional investors, that there's also an information disparity that leaves smaller investors who lack the resources of institutional investors behind. When I'm thinking about smaller investors, I'm thinking about retail investors. So think about your nurses, your teachers, your firefighters who are invested in pension plans, or workers with 401ks and IRAs. One interesting finding from a nonpartisan poll that Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund and Public Citizen sponsored found that 63% of retail investors, or regular individuals with the 401ks, IRAs, or pension plans, would factor in information about a corporation's financial risk related to climate change if that information was audited and disclosed to the SEC. We also found that 71% of retail investors would trust these disclosures if submitted to the SEC and validated by a third-party auditor. Retail investors of all ideologies were surveyed in the poll. I think it's very clear that there's a clear appetite from institutional and retail investors who are seeking this mandatory standardized disclosure, because investors know that they can use, for example, emissions data as prime comparable quantitative indicator to identify a company's vulnerability to transition risk.
Ms. Cohen, one last question, Mr. Chairman, if I could. Senator Markey, you had said that SEC has the authority to require these disclosures. You also said they have the responsibility to require that. Could you elaborate a bit on that? Ms.
Yep.
Cohen?
So yes, the SEC has a responsibility, as noted, within their mandate that to protect investors. A lot of the people who are going to be left behind are the smaller retail investors. As disparity has part of a market failure. Say that this is a responsibility on behalf of the SEC to fulfill their mandate to protect investors.
Senator Markey? One additional point.
Yes, please.
As the witnesses have pointed out, sovereign and central banks around the world and banks around America have warned of a carbon asset bubble that could create economic havoc when it bursts. And yet the American Bankers Association makes no effort to solve the climate problem. The insurance companies, particularly the property casualty insurers of America, are seeing unprecedented payouts that they have to make for climate emergencies and facing a day when they can't assess risk properly, so their business model collapses. So they warn about that, but the insurance association, their insurance lobby groups, don't come here to Congress and put any effort behind climate change. Freddie Mac warns of a coastal property values crash that's going to make the 2008 mortgage meltdown look mild. Yet the realtors of America don't come here and put any effort into climate change. Instead, you have the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which won't disclose how much fossil fuel money it takes, coming in and being as antagonistic as possible in the ways that I described earlier. One thing I would point out is that while the U.S. Chamber of Commerce may be able to tell members of Congress, as they have me, no, I'm not going to tell you anything about where I get my money, even though in any other forum where anything is being debated, you find out about your adversary's bias. They have to disclose it. You can cross-examine them, but no, not for the U.S. Chamber. But members can. It would be really hard to be a member of an organization and go to the organization and say, hey, tell me how you're funded. Tell me how this annoying thing that you're doing that I really dislike, how that relates to where your money's come from. I'm your member. You don't have a First Amendment right or any other amendment right not to tell your membership about where your funding comes from. So I think it's going to be really important to put that pressure point on the Chamber of Commerce. They ought to disclose what fossil fuel money they have received since Citizens United, and their members and their board members ought to be asking them for it, because they don't have a defense against that request. Frankly, it may very well be irresponsible corporate behavior from members of the organization not to have asked that, particularly if it comes out in some other fashion later on and you find out that Corporation X sat on the board of the Chamber of Commerce for a decade, watched all this happen, never asked basic questions about where the money was coming from to the organization that they were on the board of, and then the whole story came out what they'd turned a blind eye to. So I put the focus back on the Chamber and its members to clean up its act and stop being a bad actor in this space, in this Capitol building.
Yeah, so I was chairman over Wall Street for 10 years in the House of Representatives, and during that time, I saw an ongoing pathology. And it is that these companies all think that this information is theirs. So when we had inside trading, Wall Street Journal editorializes saying, inside trading is in the nature of the market. If those people are smart enough to get that info, they can trade on it. And the same thing was true for the penny stock market, Solomon Brothers for the government securities market, Enron with Ken Lay. All of it was information that was in the nature of the marketplace. And so what we have here is a clear effort by the Chamber of Commerce, the Chamber of Climate Deniers to kind of hide what they're doing. It's who they are. And it's the job of the government, it's the job of the SEC to do the job. So I had to author the insider trading law of 1988. You got to outlaw that. I had to pass the Penny Stock Act of 1992. I had to pass the Solomon Brothers Reform Act for the government securities market. Transparency, 100%. Everyone can see everything that's going on. Then it cures itself. The investors figure it all out. The marketplace figures it all out. Program trading, big scandal. Whether these quants were manipulating the market. Well, full disclosure, let's just see what's going on. And all of a sudden, it all sorts out because you get these game players out where everyone can see them and understand it. So that's what our goal was back in 2009 and 2010. It was to build this into the Securities Exchange Commission so that they would have this authority. And so to the extent to which Scope 3 is in contention, let's translate that into English for people who are wondering, why is this important? What is Scope 3? What does it encompass? What are the products? What are the services? What are the activities of a corporation that you want to have covered?
Having spent too much time on Scope 3, we have a book, the standard on Scope 3 financed emissions, so just category 15, several hundred pages of how you implement that across all sorts of different asset classes.
Okay, translate it into English.
Scope 1 is stuff you burn.
It's what?
Stuff you burn.
It's what?
Scope 1 is stuff you burn. So if you burn it, like you have a gas burner at your company, that is your Scope 1 emission. Scope 2 is when you pay somebody else to burn it to provide you energy. That's Scope 2.
Well, who's that?
That is, well, all of us. I mean, what?
No, that's what I'm saying. In each instance, just give us the classic example.
This is the lights, the energy that is coming in through lights or to power the television here. Those are the electricity that we purchase is Scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 is sort of everything else, but it's predominantly, a lot of your operations, it's your products, and it's your supply chain. So if you get on an airplane and you pay an airline to transport you and they're burning emissions as an airline, those are your Scope 3 emissions.
So
For banks, just one, to give you a sense of scale that Mun-Young was talking about, CDP found that bank Scope 3 emissions were 700 times greater than all of their other emissions combined.
Yeah. So climate advisors find that 83% of the food sector's emissions fall under Scope 3. That's not a small category, right? So, Ms. Ananth.
And I think that's important, when we think about these Scope 3 emissions, to understand how that intersects also with the community impact piece, right? We're thinking about the food sector emissions. Where are those emissions happening? A lot of it's coming from land use and deforestation. That's also going to be a great indicator of where is that climate risk going to come from, right? We know that supporting indigenous communities in maintaining their land rights is an important strategy for maintaining the function of those ecosystems that are the lungs of our planet. And so if we're not looking at our Scope 3 emissions, we're not understanding that transition risk. I also work on plastics, and when we think about the Scope 3 emissions of plastics, which, by the way, is a product of the fossil fuel industry, what are the emissions associated with making the oil and gas that turns into plastic, methane, and then what happens when that plastic is burned at end of life? Those are your Scope 3 emissions. You have to look all along the life cycle, or a company's not going to understand the full picture of risk.
Yeah, so again, this just goes back to industrial America saying, well, we're going to use the sky as a sewer. We're going to use the river right next to our company as a sewer. We're going to use the ground and the wells right next to our company as a sewer. And we're not responsible for that. There's no cost to it, except, the number of people who have cancer, the fact that the water can't be drunk, you cannot drink it, except for that. But it's not our responsibility. So what we're saying here is that, damage to the climate is your responsibility. And we have a right to know what you're doing to it because investors might not want to invest in your company. Investors might not want to give you, Mr. or Ms. CEO, the money. They might want to go over here to another company that does the exact same thing and invest in them because it's consistent with our values. So that's kind of what this is all about. It's a complete and total transparency that then allows investors to make the smart decisions reflecting their values. And the more you're allowed to hide it, almost like inside trading, okay, it's just completely and totally unacceptable. So what I'd like to do, because we're going to start this hearing and this meeting of all the members in a minute, I just want to thank you all so much for participating. It's
Don't
absolutely.
thank them too soon.
Oh, my goodness. It's absolutely great what you're doing. And again, we have Tom Copper, the chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee, who has joined us. I held as long as I could.
You did
Thank
great.
God, you know,
Yeah, great.
you've
I've-
arrived.
Let me just say, I've never seen a name with so many A's in it in my life. How do you pronounce your first name? Huh? How do you Well, I bet you did. I bet you did. Thanks. I apologize
of
for
course.
not being here sooner. This is an important conversation. Senator Markey and some others in the room have heard me oftentimes quote Albert Einstein. I think a lot of people, their favorite quote for Einstein is, "What is the definition of insanity?" That's to do the same thing over and over and again, expect a different result. That's a good one. But my favorite Einstein is, "In adversity lies opportunity." I love that one. My whole life I've been guided by that one. And right now, we have great adversity in the form of what's going on around our world, climate change, too much carbon, and all the things that flow from that here in this country and really throughout our planet. And I'm trying to figure out what, with respect to in adversity lies opportunity, the rule that we're discussing here today. How does this rule? How might this rule help us better look at this adversity and seize the opportunity? What would be the opportunity that could flow from the enactment of this rule, please? Would you
I'll
like to
start.
go?
Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah.
So Steve Rothstein from Profit, representing investors.
How are you today?
I'm great, Senator.
Great to see you guys.
Thank you for
Thanks for all you do.
Thanks for your time. The opportunity is, Senator Mark was just talking before about transparency leads to better things in the marketplace. This will lead to more transparency, so investors and companies know more about what's happening. They can make smarter decisions. That makes our economy stronger in this country because many other countries are already leading in this way. There are 8 countries that already have rules like this. Many others are thinking about it. So it will lead to smarter investments. There are also enormous opportunities where the world needs to spend probably $8 to $9 trillion a year because of all the new climate opportunities. This will tell people, so it'll telegraph where the opportunities are, where the risks are, and then for marginalized communities, not wait till the end. Not wait till the end, whether it be a flood in Delaware or anyplace else, to have more information for the company and the supply chain.
That's great. That's good. That's very helpful. Who would like to go second?
Sure, and
I'd just like to say that scope, it doesn't mean that it can exist anywhere within your value chain, and that will definitely affect your business. The SEC climate disclosure rule is not about assigning blame or punishing companies. It's really about assigning risk and providing investors, big and small, access to the standardized information that they need to really compare the data between companies. And this is a positive step forward.
Thank you, Munyon. Yes.
tremendous being able to be proactive. When I've looked at all of these case studies about community impacts and these amazing resistance fights that have been led by local communities, they should not be a surprise to companies anymore. They have the ability to plan for these things, to understand the impacts on communities. This rule is about giving us the transparency, giving investors the transparency, and giving those companies the transparency so that they can adapt to these risks, to mitigate these risks, and to think about how their activities will affect local communities.
Thank you. Ivan.
I'll give you sort of opportunity at two different levels. First, as a bank now, I mentioned we are financing 32% of our balance sheet loans and investments are going into climate solutions. What that does is give us an emissions intensity for our portfolio that is probably 1/10 of what the big banks have under their portfolio. And so for us, we think of that as an opportunity. For investors looking to make low carbon investments, we're that. And we've engaged our portfolio companies under that premise. So we take used car sales or storage companies, physical storage companies where they have a lot of real estate. And we say, look, you have great opportunities here to use clean energy, to host clean energy, to generate revenue from that, and to change your emissions profile in a way that is going to make you more attractive to the hundreds of trillions of investors that are looking to align and to reduce the emissions intensity of their portfolio.
Great. Let me close, if I could, Albert Einstein story. I take the train, as Eddie knows, just about every day we're in session, back and forth between Delaware and Washington, D.C., from Biden Station to Union Station. That's where my life is. Not always, but a lot. Albert Einstein used to take the train a lot. He lived, was in New Jersey. Where did he live? You anybody remember? It's, pardon? Princeton, yeah. And didn't think he had a job there. But in any event, he would take the train a lot from Princeton to New York City or Princeton down to D.C. And one day he's got on the train and immediately started looking for his ticket. He started looking in his coat pocket, his pants and shirt, and his briefcase, and he was having a hard time finding it. The conductor comes up and says, "Dr. Einstein, we know you take the train all the time. It's okay. We know who you are. You don't have to worry. We know who you are." And the conductor turns around and walks away. He gets to the other end of the car, and he's about to leave the car, and he looks back, and Dr. Einstein's in the car on his hands and knees looking for his ticket. The conductor rushes back there. Dr. Einstein says, "Dr. Einstein, no, don't do this. Don't do this. We know who you are. We know who you are." And Dr. Einstein looks up at the conductor and says, "Young man, I know who I am, too. I just don't know where I'm going." And for that, the reason why I tell that story is you've given us a better idea of where we need to go. And it's a huge challenge that we face for our planet, for our country. But if we play it right, we can come out in pretty good shape. A lot of jobs create a lot of economic opportunity. And we thank you for helping us to seize that opportunity in this great adversity. Thank you.
And I've got our final Albert Einstein story, which is
Okay.
that the one thing we know about him is that E equals mc squared. We don't even understand what it means. We just know that the smartest person who ever lived came up with it. And it's absolutely accurate. But what we don't know is that in 1922, he won his Nobel Prize. And he won his Nobel Prize for his discovery.
Said 100 years ago.
For his discovery of the law of photoelectric effect, solar.
How do you know this?
So he won his Nobel on what we're trying to unleash and allow investors to move towards. So
we're like.
Here's the thing: you don't have to be Albert Einstein to figure out that solar is our
Apparently
future.
not.
We did need him to figure out how the technology works. Okay, but now that it's been incorporated into our society, thank you, Albert Einstein.
Well, we're the descendants of Einstein, you and me. So.
Thank you all so much for being here with us today, and we're going to try our best to keep the pressure on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for
Thank you very much.
Eddie, that was great. Thanks for letting me do this.
No, of course.
And thank you for doing this.
And thanks for a comment.